So is debt settlement a better option than bankruptcy? Well, let's find out. Welcome to the Ascend Finance YouTube channel, where we try to help folks understand the differences between debt settlement and bankruptcy. You know, since it kind of feels like new debt relief kind of type programs are constantly being introduced, I wanted to cover debt settlement and bankruptcy and kind of how that all works now that we're in 2024. All right, so before I get too far though, just remember this video is really just made for informational purposes only and should not be construed as any kind of legal or financial advice. Okay, so today I'm going to cover a few things. First, I'm going to talk about the credit score impact for both debt settlement and bankruptcy. Then I'm going to talk about how debt settlement actually works. Then I'll cover Chapter 7 versus Chapter 13 bankruptcy. And then finally, I'll talk about which is better, debt settlement or bankruptcy. So one thing you may notice, we actually covered this kind of topic back in 2022. But I do feel like there have been some changes, so I wanted to recreate this video with new and additional updated information. I will also say that this may end up being a bit of a longer video, so I actually added what they're called chapters to the video, so you can actually just kind of see a breakdown of each section of this video and skip around to the topics that you may be most interested in. Alrighty, I know there's a lot to cover, so let's get into the first thing. First thing I want to talk about is what's the credit score impact and how does that kind of look comparatively for debt settlement and bankruptcy, right? So are they the same? Are they different? How do those kind of size up? Now, realistically, to fully understand the credit score impact, you know, for either option, we kind of really want to understand where your credit score is at when you start either of these options, whether you file bankruptcy or whether you start a debt settlement program. So to kind of help do this, let's look at an example and we'll compare each option's estimated credit score impact. So let's say there's someone named Mark, okay? And so for Mark, he owes, let's say $30,000 in credit card debt. Let's also say that all the credit card debt is 6 months behind and his credit score is in the 500s somewhere. It's not as important, the specific number, let's just say it's in the 500s. All right, so how would Mark's credit score be impacted then if he signed up for a debt settlement program? And I'll actually dive deeper into how debt settlement works shortly, but for now, all we really need to know is with debt settlement, it's kind of the process of basically just negotiating past due debt. So now that we kind of have that understanding, let's talk about the credit score impact there. So if Mark signs up for a debt relief program, since his debt's already 6 months past due, the actual process of a debt settlement program may not really hurt his credit score. To clarify though, if Mark was current on all of his debt when he signed up, well then yes, the process may impact his credit score because he'd have to fall behind on the debt. And I'll dive into more of that kind of details shortly. Okay, so now let's look at bankruptcy. So if Mark were to file Chapter 7 bankruptcy, it's important to understand that that may be reported on his credit report for the next 10 years. But does that actually impact his score? Not necessarily, but it definitely can. I will say though, since the debt is past due and his credit score is in the 500s, there is the possibility that filing a Chapter 7 could have some improvements to his credit score. Not always, it may go down a little bit, it may not go down that much, but sometimes it can be improved. So you could be thinking then, well, how is that possible? Well, think of it this way. When he files Chapter 7, most of his accounts are pretty much negatively impacting his credit score. And so those are finally coming off. Also, his credit score is already in the 500s, so it's generally unlikely it would drop a lot more than that. It could, but similar to debt settlement, if Mark was current on everything and let's say his score was in the 700s, well then yes, Chapter 7 would most likely impact his credit score negatively. Okay, so before I dive into how debt settlement really works, let me regroup on this. So for those who are thinking, wow, Justin, your explanation of the credit score impact is so obvious. Clearly, if Mark's score is in the 500s and the debt's past due, neither option's really gonna hurt his credit score. But here's my reply to that. I will say it seems like there's a lot of interesting information being spread by either different kind of companies or just different people, basically preaching that debt settlement impacts your score less than bankruptcy. And so I wanted to kind of show you an example where that's just not always the case. Frankly, I will say there are a lot of examples that I could show you where bankruptcy may actually allow you to rebuild your credit score faster than debt settlement. But always keep in mind, everyone's situation is unique and everyone's going to have a different kind of outcome. But That's kind of my explanation there. Okay, so because I want to make sure this video isn't 30 minutes long, I'll move on to the next piece. But if you are curious about your specific credit score impact to either option or maybe both, you're welcome to give us a call at 833-272-3631, and we'll be happy to kind of chat through your situation and give you some insight. Okay, so I know I touched briefly on kind of the process of debt settlement, but I didn't really get into it that much. So let's now talk about how debt settlement actually works. Now, why do you think I'm emphasizing with the actually? Well, simply put, I think this topic is often underexplained or explained in a way where it makes it seem like it's less impactful than it is. And when I say impactful, I mean basically it seems like the cons of this option is breezed over in a lot of times. So I really want to get into it. So first, let's break down what the process of debt settlement is. So debt settlement is the process of negotiating with creditors to settle a past due balance of a debt account. Okay, so with that in mind then, there may be some questions that you're thinking. Well, one question could be, how past due does an account need to be settled? Like how far behind does it need to be? Another question could be, well, what if I'm not behind? Would I need to intentionally stop paying? And then another potential question could be, well, could a creditor sue me for a past due debt? Am I falling behind on the debt? Then could I be potentially sued? And then the final question I want to kind of briefly touch on is, well, how much do I actually have to pay a company to do this? Now, of course, there may be other questions you're thinking, but for this case, let's address each of those one by one. Okay, so the first question, how far behind does an account need to be for it to be settled on? In short, generally accounts need to be charged off or maybe like 4 to 6 months past due before a creditor really has any kind of incentive to settle, but every situation is unique, especially different creditors may have different settlement processes. The next thing actually kind of goes into the next question is, what if I'm not behind? So if you're not behind on the debt and you're either considering this option because you've heard of it or because some company's trying to convince you that it's the best option, here's one thing to think about. Are you seeing that you'll need to fall behind on the debt? Frankly, if you're not seeing that you'd have to fall behind on the debt, then it may make sense to consider alternative options before signing up. Of course, that'll be up to you, but there are oftentimes other options to consider that may solve your current pain point. Okay, so the third question, could a creditor sue you during this process? Well, simply put, yes. Now, what's the risk of that actually happening? Ultimately, it may come down to whether you own maybe any high value assets or basically your creditor mix. But let me explain a little bit more on what I mean about that. So most creditors have a history of suing if they tend to sue. So if the debt settlement company you're signing up with or potentially working with has enough data on each creditor, they should be able to give you a decent idea of your risk, especially decent idea of the high-risk creditors that you owe. Now, you may not have any high-risk creditors. So if that's the case, then you may not be really someone that would be at risk of a lawsuit. Of course, there's always still a chance. It can be important to consider your creditor mix when looking at debt settlement. Okay, so before I move on to the detailed timeline and the breakdown of like the debt settlement process, let me explain how these debt settlement companies make money. Let me clarify something though. There seem to be more and more debt settlement law firms. If you're finding that you're speaking with a law firm that offers debt settlement, they may be able to charge upfront fees and potentially higher fees. Now, on the other hand, if you're more so just talking to a traditional debt settlement company that's not a law firm, they should be very regulated on how they take their fees. So here's how that all works. So a debt settlement company charges fees based on a percentage of the enrolled debt. The fee percent is generally between 15 to 25%, sometimes more I've seen. For example, if you have $50,000 in the program and the company is charging you a 25% fee, then they would be making in total about $12,500. However, regulations should force these companies to only take their fee once a settlement has been made. That way they're not charging any upfront fees. They also can only take a fee proportional to the account they are settling. So if they settle a $10,000 account, although you are including $50,000 total into the program, and they're charging you 25%, then they would only be able to take $2,500 from the bank account after settling that $10,000 account. Okay, so all of that said though, it seems like there are a lot of times where the salespeople will just say, the fee is already included in the monthly payment, and they don't actually tell you the specific percentage. It's key to make sure that they tell you the fee percent, because if you don't know that, you either A, may have a harder time comparing to other companies and comparing the fees, or B, you may not realize how much money you're paying just towards the debt settlement company's fees and not your actual debt. I will say though, if you're at a point where you're already feeling like debt settlement may be your best option and you want to figure out the best companies out there, I'll link in the description where you can check out what we call the top debt relief companies. Okay, so let me now go through and kind of break down an end-to-end timeline of the debt settlement process. So first, you sign up with a debt settlement company, and what you're going to do is open up a special purpose bank account that's basically going to be used to store funds. And then you're going to start making a monthly or sometimes a bi-weekly deposit into that special purpose bank account. Okay, I'll quickly jump in and say though, if you want to estimate what the monthly payment may be based on your debt amount, you can feel free to take our free debt options calculator that I actually linked in the description below. It's going to give you a breakdown of each option. It'll tell you the credit score impact for each option. It'll tell you the total cost for each option, and then it'll actually tell you the estimated monthly payments for each option. The calculator is 100% free, and you don't even need to add an email address to see the results. Okay, so let's move on to the next thing. So once you're making payments and you're in the program, you'll start letting the accounts fall behind month after month. Once the accounts are at a point where the creditors are willing to settle for less, the debt settlement company will use the funds in the special purpose bank account to work out settlement agreements with each creditor. After all the accounts are settled and paid for, you ideally will now graduate from the program and ultimately you should be debt free. I hope that gives you a decent idea of how the process works and some other important details to consider. Okay, before I dive into bankruptcy, if you feel like this video has been helpful so far and it could be helpful for others, would you consider hitting that like button below? It's super encouraging for us to see, but it also helps tell YouTube to show this video to others. Let's help each other get out of debt. Alrighty, let's now dive into bankruptcy and how Chapter 7 and Chapter 13 compare. So first, we have Chapter 7 bankruptcy. It's known as the liquidation bankruptcy, but I like to call it the bankruptcy that most people are familiar with. Now, it's totally okay if you're not familiar with either of them though, as I'm going to explain both of them right now. So Chapter 7 is the process of basically eliminating unsecured debt by filing a petition through the court. You basically pay an attorney to file the case unless you decided to do it yourself. And after the case has been filed, you may be discharged, complete, from the bankruptcy in about 4 months. Now, one thing you may be asking yourself is, can anyone do this? Simply put, no. You'd actually have to qualify for a Chapter 7. The courts have a means test you have to pass that's based on your income and expenses to basically see whether you're eligible for a discharge of the debt. How I kind of like to explain it to people is, the court's basically trying to see, do you have the means to pay back some or all of the debt? Then if they find that you do, then it can sometimes be challenging to qualify for a 7. Not always, but sometimes. I'll break down how the mean test works, but if you're interested in a super detailed explanation, feel free to watch our video going into detail on Chapter 7 bankruptcy. I will jump in again one more time and say the debt options calculator I mentioned earlier can also give you information on Chapter 7 qualifications, so feel free to take the free debt options calculator link below if you're interested in learning more. Okay, let's talk about the means test a bit. So the first part of the means test basically considers your household gross annual income and compares it to the income limit for your state and household size. One other quick thing to consider with a Chapter 7 is the fact that there could be assets at risk of being sold during the process. Now, most states have exemptions that you can use that potentially protect your assets, but it's something to think about. You're always welcome to call us at that 833-272-3631 number. We can try to give you more information on that. All right, so now let's quickly touch on Chapter 13 bankruptcy. So Chapter 13 is different than Chapter 7 due to the fact that most everyone can file it and you don't really need to qualify. It's also different in the sense that you would actually make monthly payments in a Chapter 13 for either 3 or 5 years. So basically, I like to call it the disposable income based plan. So the court's basically putting you in a plan that has you pay back some or sometimes all of the debt relative to your disposable income. Now, of course, there are other factors that can impact your Chapter 13 plan, like maybe having more equity in certain assets than what the exemption allows for your state. But honestly, if you want a more detailed breakdown of how all of that works, you can check out our Chapter 13 bankruptcy video. I'll link that as well. All right, so now that we have a decent understanding of how debt settlement works and how bankruptcy works, let's talk about if one option is better than the other. This may seem like an obvious answer, but it really depends on everyone's situation. Everyone's situation is unique, so it really does depend on where you're at, but let me break down a few things if you're not sure what to do. So if you're finding that you're going to have to fall behind on the debt soon, then either of those options may be helpful to consider. Now, if you find that you qualify for a Chapter 7 and you're falling behind on the debt, then there's a chance that Chapter 7 could be cheaper, easier, and faster than a debt settlement program. That being said, it's important to understand and make sure your assets are protected and that you have enough debt to justify a Chapter 7 bankruptcy. At that same token, if you're finding that you don't qualify for a Chapter 7 and you're falling behind on the debt, then it may make sense to dive deeper into what your planned payment could potentially be if you did a Chapter 13 and see if the Chapter 13 may actually be more expensive than a debt settlement program, because that totally can happen. Ultimately, if you're strongly considering any of these options, it can be helpful to assess your risk of being sued in a debt settlement program and whether you even qualify for a Chapter 7. If you're researching your options and trying to figure out what to do, feel free to take that debt options calculator that I linked in the description below. It'll give you a breakdown of each option. It'll tell you about the credit score impact from each option, the total cost for each option, and it gives you a breakdown of the estimated monthly payments for each one. Also, you're always welcome just to call us at 833-272-3631. Thank you so much for sticking around till the end. I appreciate you watching, and I hope you have a great day.